acid rain devoured the planet's surface 17 years ago. 12,000 people took refuge 300 meters underground and are slowly dying. And then, on the cold concrete, an engineer from a dead world woke up in a stranger's body, the one who knows how to bring people back to the surface. But no one is about to let him go. Dan opens his eyes and doesn't recognize a thing. Not the ceiling, not the walls, not even his own hands. His fingers are thin and unfamiliar. His skin is pale, almost bluish. His body is light and weak, like that of a teenager recovering from an illness. He tries to sit up and nearly falls back down. His muscles won't obey him. His head is spinning, but his brain is already working. The lamp above him is an LED, a cheap one. The light has shifted toward yellow. That means at least a third of the diodes have died. The walls are made of concrete, low-grade concrete. Cracks and voids are seeping through. They were poured in a hurry, without vibration. Somewhere behind the wall, a heat recovery unit is humming, an old model. The filters are clogged. Judging by the sound, the ventilation is pulling at about 70%, maybe 60%. Dan doesn't yet realize where he is, but he can already see that the building was poorly constructed. Two people are standing over him, a woman in her 30s in a gray lab coat and a respirator. Her eyes are tired, dark circles under her eyes from chronic lack of sleep. Next to her is a man, gray-haired, a military uniform without insignia, just a patch on his sleeve, Sector 7. The soldier speaks in Korean, a North Korean accent, harsh and choppy. He asks what his name is and where he's from. Dan understands every word. And that's when things get strange. Back in Seattle, he only spoke Korean with his grandmother, but here, the language rolls off his tongue as if it were his native tongue. The woman leans in closer. She asks if he remembers his name, where he is, what happened. Dan sits down. He winces from pain in every muscle. He looks at his hands. They aren't his hands. He looks at his legs. They aren't his legs. The body is someone else's. Young, about 25 years old, painfully thin. His ribs protrude through the gray fabric. He should be scared. He should scream. He should thrash about in panic. Instead, he stares intently at the ventilation grill in the corner of the ceiling and says that the ventilation efficiency is 70%, that if the air ducts aren't cleaned within a month, mold will start growing, and half the sector will start coughing up blood. The soldier freezes. The woman stops writing. Dan adds that he needs an hour and a diagram of the air ducts, and he'll show them exactly where the hole is. Silence hangs in the air for about 10 seconds. Then the soldier slowly pulls out his tablet and starts taking notes. He doesn't ask how Dan knows this. He just takes notes. The woman looks at the soldier. The soldier looks at the woman. Then both of them fix their gaze on Dan. And Dan realizes one thing. They won't let him go now. The next 2 days are crammed into a quarantine bay. 4 walls, a cot, a lamp, a bucket in the corner. They shove food at him twice a day. A gray paste, odorless and tasteless, in a metal bowl. Water is poured out by the glass. Dan eats, drinks, sleeps, and thinks. The body isn't his. He accepts that as a fact. Panic won't help. He's an engineer. An engineer works with what's available. And this is what's available. He's alive. He's in some kind of underground facility. Deep underground. Judging by the air pressure, 200 or 300 meters below the surface. The facility is enormous. The hum of machines and distant voices seep through the walls. Thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands. The air is filtered. That means something is broken down up above. The concrete is shoddy, so they built it in a hurry. The lights are dying out, so there's no production or resources to replace them. The food is synthetic, so there's no natural food. Dan lies on his cot and pieces the picture together. Every detail is a fragment of a puzzle, and the puzzle is coming together into a very grim picture. On the third day, the door swings open. That same soldier enters. He's no longer wearing a respirator. His face is stern. His wrinkles are deep. His eyes are sharp and cold. He introduces himself. Colonel Seo Minjae, commander of Sector 7, Hive North 7, formerly Pyeongchang, the largest underground city on the Asian continent. 12,000 people. Dan listens. The colonel speaks concisely and without emotion. 17 years ago, an atmospheric catastrophe scorched the surface. A cascade of failed climate projects. The explosion of a stratospheric aerosol installations. The rain turned acidic, pH 2.1. Metal rusts in a matter of days. Concrete crumbles in a matter of months. Skin suffers chemical burns in a matter of minutes. The cities were deserted. Humanity went underground, into the former subway systems, into military bunkers, into hastily dug hives at a depth of 200 to 400 meters. Dan listens and doesn't interrupt. The colonel presses on. The hives are dying. The reactors are reaching the end of their service life. Fungal cultures are mutating. The birth rate has been falling for the third year in a row. The councils of the depths are fighting over the scraps. Up above, the rain seems to be letting up. For the past 2 years, the pH has been fluctuating between 3.5 and 4 during the lulls between storms. But every expedition returns with casualties, or doesn't return at all. The colonel falls silent. He fixes his gaze on Dan and fires off a barrage of questions. Who is he? How does he know about ventilation? And why does he speak like an engineer, a profession that hasn't existed for 15 years? Dan thinks for 30 seconds. Then he answers. He won't explain how he got here, but he'll explain what he can do. He's an engineer, a specialist in closed ecosystems, hydroponics, desalination, closed-loop water cycles, biodomes, emergency life support systems. He'll fix their ventilation. He'll bring in the harvest. He'll build a system that works. But he needs people, materials, and access. The colonel holds his gaze for a long time. Then he stands up. He announces that tomorrow morning Dan will be taken to the Winter Garden, the main greenhouse of Sector 7, the pride of the Hive. 800 square meters of hydroponics. It feeds 12,000 people. Yields have been plummeting for the past 3 months. If Dan spots the problem, the colonel will believe him. If he doesn't, he'll be sent back to quarantine to rot until they figure out what to do with him. Dan nods. The colonel leaves. The door slams shut. Dan lies down and closes his eyes. He isn't sleeping. He's calculating. Page 2.1. Sulfuric acid, nitric acid. A combination. Aerosol systems means sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere. A cascade failure means an uncontrolled reaction. The surface is dead, but the pH is creeping up. 3.5 to 4. That's no longer death. It's the acid rain of a 20th century industrial zone. We can work with this. Buffer solutions, ground olivine, limestone fields, biochar, fungal mats. Put it all together and scale it up, and the surface can be restored. Theoretically. In practice, it'll take tons of materials and hundreds of hands. But first, the greenhouse. First, prove that he's not crazy. Dan opens his eyes. He looks at the flashing light, and for the first time in 3 days, he smiles. Not out of joy, out of anticipation for the work ahead. The morning began with the clang of a door. 2 soldiers in gray uniforms led Dan out of the quarantine bay and down the hallway. The first thing he saw outside the isolation booth was people. Lots of people. The hallway was wide, about 4 meters, concrete walls, pipes running along the ceiling, lead strips every 3 meters, and people. They were walking in both directions, gray clothes, gray faces, thin, all of them thin. Dan looked at them and did the math. Judging by their degree of emaciation, the daily caloric intake here was 1,000 to 1,200. Not starvation, but chronic malnutrition. Everyone's skin was pale, without exception. Vitamin D deficiency. 17 years without sunlight. Many had hunched shoulders, childhood rickets. The children he saw were small for their age. Some were coughing. The air, the ventilation. He was right. They walked for about 10 minutes, past the living quarters, past the communal dining hall from which the smell of boiled mushrooms wafted, past the school. Dan heard children's voices behind the door and slowed his pace. A soldier nudged him forward. They went down 2 levels. They passed through a heavy metal door marked Winter Garden. And Dan saw the greenhouse. 800 square meters, 4 tiers of shelving, lead panels above each tier, drip irrigation tubes, trays of greenery. But the greenery wasn't right. Dan could see it from the doorway. The leaves were pale, yellow at the edges, chlorosis. Some of the plants were spindly, stretching toward the light. That meant there wasn't enough light, or the spectrum was wrong. He stepped inside. Colonel Seo was standing at the entrance with his arms crossed. Next to him was a man in his 50s, tall, nervous, hands in his pockets. It was Park Hyunsu, Ulya's chief engineer. The colonel introduced them. Park looked at Dan as if he were an insect, a skinny guy from quarantine, 25 years old, no documents, no history. For 30 years, Park had been Sector 7's leading technical authority. He had built this winter garden with his own 2 hands, and now some ragged kid was going to evaluate it? Dan paid no attention to his gaze. He was already at work. He walked over to the first shelf. He touched a leaf. Soft, limp, turgor below normal. He flipped the leaf over. The underside was clean, so it wasn't fungus, not pests. The problem is with the nutrients or the light. He moved on. He leaned over a tray. He sniffed the solution. Excess magnesium, a characteristic bitter smell. He stood up and looked up. Lamps. LED panels. White light. But not the right kind of white. The spectrum had shifted. Too much red, not enough blue. These panels had reached the end of their service life. The diodes had degraded. Photosynthetically active radiation had dropped by at least 40%. He walked along the racks. 5 minutes. 10. He touched the leaves, sniffed them, looked at the irrigation tubes. He stopped in the 3rd section. He crouched down. He ran his finger along a tube. The angle was off. The tubes were pointing the wrong way. This section had been removed for repairs and reinstalled in a mirror image configuration. Half the plants were drowning, half were withering. He stood up straight. He turned to the colonel and Pack and began to speak. He said there were 3 problems. The first, the lamps had degraded. The spectrum had shifted toward the red. Photosynthesis had dropped by 40%. The plants were starving for light. The panels needed to be replaced, or at least blue diodes needed to be added to the existing ones. Second, the solution. The formula was old, but the water came from a new source. It has an excess of magnesium. Magnesium blocks calcium absorption. That's why there's chlorosis. We need to adjust the solution. Remove magnesium sulfate from the formula completely. Add calcium nitrate. Third, the 3rd section of the racks. The irrigation tubes are sloped downward. Half the plants are drowning. The other half are. Flip the section over. It'll take 2 hours. Pack's face was red. His hands were clenched into fists. 30 years of experience. And here was a kid who, in 15 minutes, had found 3 mistakes he hadn't seen in 3 months. Dan wasn't looking at Pak. He was looking at the Colonel, and he said he needed 4 days, 30 workers, access to the chemical warehouse, and he'll increase the yield by 2.5 times. The Colonel didn't answer. He was looking somewhere behind Dan. Dan turned around. A young woman was standing by the third rack, about 25 or 26 years old, short, skinny, like everyone here. Her dark hair was pulled back into a short ponytail. Her hands were buried in the soil up to her elbows. She was looking at Dan, not with hostility like Pak, not with suspicion like the soldiers, with recognition, as if she already knew everything he'd just said, but was afraid to say it out loud. Dan pointed at her. He told the Colonel that this girl from the third shift should be made the senior agronomist. She already understood everything. She was just afraid to say it. The girl flinched. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at the Colonel. The Colonel looked at her. Then at Dan, then at her again. Then he took out his tablet. He made a note. The 4-day period began at that very hour. The Colonel gave him 20 workers, not 30, 20, and access to the warehouse, limited access. Dan didn't argue. He worked with what he had. The girl's name was Seo Haeun. She came to see him an hour after the Colonel left. She introduced herself. She said she'd been working at the Winter Garden for 4 years. She said she'd noticed a problem with the pipes 2 months ago. She'd written a report to Park. Park told her she was wrong. She fell silent. Dan nodded. He asked if she knew what Hoglin's solution was. Haeun froze. Then she quietly replied that she didn't. Dan smiled. He said she'd know in 4 days. They got to work. Day 1. The pipes in the third section. Dan personally showed the 5-person crew how to flip the section over and reconnect the irrigation lines. 2 hours of work. When they were done, Dan turned on the water and checked the slope with a level. Even. Just right. The workers looked at him strangely. They were used to taking orders from people who had never done manual labor themselves. But Dan was kneeling in the mud alongside them, tightening the fittings. Day 2. The nutrient solution. Dan spent 3 hours with Hyun, poring over the nutrient chart. He explained. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and micronutrients. She listened without blinking, writing down every word. Then he dictated the formula for the new solution to her. Hyun read it twice. Then she looked at Dan and said it was too simple, that it couldn't be that simple. Dan replied that the best solutions are always simple. Complex solutions mean the engineer didn't understand the problem. Day 3. Lamps. This was harder. There were no new panels. Dan spent 2 hours rummaging through the warehouse. He found a box of old blue diodes, discarded but still functional. He and Haeun manually resoldered 200 diodes and inserted them into the existing panels. The spectrum changed, not perfectly, but enough. The plants would get blue light. Day 4. Dan walked around all the shelves. He checked every tray, every tube, every panel. Then he sat down on the floor against the wall and closed his eyes. Haeun brought him a bowl of mushroom paste. He ate it without opening his eyes. She sat down next to him, in silence. They sat there for about 10 minutes. Then Haeun asked how he knew all this. Dan opened his eyes, looked at her, said it was from another life. Haeun didn't press him for details. She just nodded, as if that were a perfectly normal answer. 2 weeks later, Colonel Seo came to the Winter Garden. He was accompanied by Park Hyunsu and 4 representatives from the sector council. The leaves were green, dark, thick. The shelves stood straight. The nutrient solution smelled right. The meters showed a yield 2.7 times higher than a month ago. The colonel turned to Park. Park remained silent. His face was stony. The colonel turned to Dan, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled. Just the corner of his mouth, barely noticeable. He said that from that moment on, Dan was the technical advisor for Sector 7. He would be given a team of 30 people, living quarters, access to the warehouses, and Level 3 security clearance. Dan nodded. He looked at Hyun. She was standing by a shelf with lush green leaves and smiling, quietly, with just her eyes. Park Hyunsu turned and walked out of the winter garden, without saying a word. His back was straight, his stride was steady, his fists were clenched. Dan noticed and realized that this man would be a problem. Dan spent his first month as technical advisor with almost no sleep. 4 hours a day, sometimes 3. His body was young but weak, undernourished. His muscles were thin. He'd be out of breath after climbing 2 flights of stairs. But his mind was sharp. And that was what mattered most. Colonel Seo had given him 30 men. Dan divided them into 5 groups of 6. Each group had a task. The first group: audit all ventilation systems in Sector 7. Every air duct, every filter, every heat exchanger. Draw up a map. Mark where things are clogged, where there are leaks, where there's mold. Second group: take inventory of the warehouses. All chemicals, all materials, everything there is. Third group: water supply. Where does the water come from? What is its quality? What filters are used? When were they last replaced? Fourth group: power systems, reactor, generators, batteries. How much life is left? Fifth group: waste. Where does the trash go? Where do human waste products go? Is there recycling? The people on his team looked at him in bewilderment. They were used to a different leadership style. Here, the boss would issue a general order, and the subordinates would figure out for themselves how to carry it out. Usually, not at all. Dan worked differently. Each group had a clear assignment, specific questions that needed answers, a deadline, and a report format. He laid it all out on paper. He handed them out and said he expected results in 3 days. 3 days later, he received them. The situation was worse than he'd thought. Ventilation was operating at 65% capacity throughout the sector. In the residential blocks on the lower levels, there were areas where CO2 levels were 1.5 times the norm. People there got sick more often. They coughed. Children were falling behind in their development. Mold was found at 14 locations. Water supply. The main source is an underground spring. It's clean, but the coarse filters were last changed 2 years ago. The fine filters, 6 months ago. The water has elevated levels of magnesium and iron. Not dangerous, but it affects the hydroponics. Reactor. Old. Korean-made. According to the documentation, its service life expired 4 years ago. It's kept running through constant repairs. The chief reactor engineer told Dan's team that it has another 3 to 5 years left. Maybe 7 if we're lucky. Waste. There was no recycling. Organic waste was dumped into the lower tunnel. Biological waste went there too. It rotted. It stank. It emitted methane. Dan read all 5 reports. He sat down at the table. He took a sheet of paper and he began to draw. 6 hours later, he had a plan. Not some grand plan to save the world, a practical plan for the next 30 days. Clean out the ventilation system. Start with the critically contaminated zones. Replace the filters. Make the ones that are missing from whatever materials are on hand. Set up composting. Organic waste isn't trash, it's fertilizer, it's fuel, it's heat. He called Haeun over. He showed her the section on compost. She read it. She looked at him. She asked what compost was. Dan blinked. He asked if she was serious. Haeun shrugged. She said the words sounded familiar, but she didn't know exactly what it was or how it worked. Dan rubbed his face with his palms. Then he explained. Organic waste, plant debris, biological waste. You pile it up, you create the right conditions for microorganisms, temperature, moisture, and aeration. They break down the waste into a nutrient-rich substrate in 2 to 4 weeks. Free fertilizer, made from trash. Hyun looked at him. Then she said, it sounded like magic. Dan laughed. He said it was microbiology. Hyun smiled and said that in the Hive, it was one and the same. That same day, Dan found out about the book. One of his workers, a young man named Jung, brought him a thick volume with a worn cover. He placed it on the table reverently and said it was the sacred book of engineering, the primary source of all technical knowledge in the Hive. Dan opened it, a textbook on the mechanics of materials, published in 2008, Moscow State University of Civil Engineering, in Russian, with Korean notes in the margins. Half the pages were missing. The remaining pages were worn thin from frequent use. Dan flipped through the pages and felt his jaw clench. It was a basic second semester course, beginner level. In his world, a textbook like this would sit in a stack on a shelf, and no one would open it after the exam. Here, it was treated like a revelation. He closed the book, put it back. He looked at Chong. The guy was about 20, intelligent eyes, lively, but there was fear in them. Dan asked what was wrong. Chong hesitated. Then he said he wanted to ask something but was afraid it was a stupid question. Dan said there were no stupid questions. Chong asked what a percentage was. He'd come across the word in the book but didn't understand what it meant. Dan froze. Then he sat down next to Chong. He picked up a pencil. He drew a circle. He divided it into 10 parts. And in 2 minutes, he explained what a percentage was. Chong's face changed right before his eyes, from fear to surprise, from surprise to understanding, from understanding to joy. Pure, childlike joy that the world had become a little more understandable. Dan looked at him and realized the scale of the disaster. Not on the outside, on the inside. 17 years without an education, without teachers, without a system. An entire generation had grown up on scraps of knowledge, on a cargo cult, on tattered textbooks they read like sacred texts without understanding half the words. These people aren't stupid. They're hungry. Hungry not just for food, for knowledge. By the end of the first month, Dan had finished his main project for this phase, an experimental mini-dome, 50 square meters, built in one of the empty technical rooms, Ulya. A frame made of metal pipes, a covering of recycled plastic. Inside, soil. Real soil. Mixed from compost and a mineral substrate according to a formula Dan came up with off the top of his head. LEDs with a new spectrum, the very ones he had resoldered. A closed-loop irrigation system. And in that soil, under that light, real strawberry plants were growing. Not hydroponics, not algae paste. Real plants in real soil. Haeun planted the seeds herself. Dan found them in the warehouse, old ones, discarded ones. Their germination rate was questionable, but out of 20 seeds, 14 sprouted. 2 weeks later, the plants bloomed. A month later, the first berries appeared. Small, pale, not perfect, but real. When the first strawberry ripened, Haeun picked it. A tiny red berry the size of a fingernail. She looked at it, sniffed it, then put it in her mouth, chewed slowly, closed her eyes, and cried. Dan stood beside her, silently. He knew that Haeun was 26 years old, that she was born in the Hive, that she had never tasted a strawberry in her life, had never seen one grow, didn't know what it tasted like. Haeun opened her eyes. She looked at Dan. She said one word. Sweet. Dan nodded. Delegations from neighboring sectors began arriving 3 days later. First the engineers, then the officials, Then ordinary residents who had heard the rumors. Everyone wanted to see the mini dome. Everyone wanted to see the strawberries. Some stood at the entrance and just looked, silently, for a long time, like in a museum. Park Hyunsu never came even once. Dan conducted a full audit of Sector 7 systems and discovered critical problems with ventilation and waste processing. He built an experimental mini-dome with real strawberry bushes and began teaching the team basic engineering skills. Ha-in tasted strawberries for the first time in her life, and delegations from neighboring sectors began arriving to see the mini-dome. In the 6th week, Dan met Emily Park. Or rather, he had met her before. She was the woman in the isolation booth. But back then, she had been just a voice and a pair of tired eyes peering out from behind a respirator. Now she had come to him on her own. An accident had occurred in Sector 7's medical wing, a leak in the water supply system. Water from the service line had entered the sterile circuit. 3 operating rooms were flooded. The supply of antibiotics had gotten wet. Some of it was ruined. Emily came into his office, without knocking. She stood in the doorway. She said she had a problem and that Colonel Seo had advised her to come to him. Dan looked at her. Without her respirator, she looked different. Her face was stern. Her cheekbones were sharp. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was short, almost a military cut. Her hands were strong, accustomed to hard work. She spoke Korean with an American accent, just like him. Dan stood up. He gathered 3 people from his team. He went to the medical unit. The problem was simple. A utility pipe ran right next to a medical one. Vibration from the pump had loosened the mounting. The pipe cracked. Water seeped through the wall. Dan fixed it in 4 hours. He welded the pipe. He relocated the mounting bracket. He installed a vibration damper on the pump. He rerouted the utility line a meter away from the medical line. While his people were working, he inspected the entire medical block, out of habit, and he saw what he'd seen everywhere in the Hive. The same low-quality concrete, the same clogged filters, the same deteriorated light bulbs. But there was something else here. The medical block's ceiling had a crack running through it. A thin one, almost invisible. Dan ran his finger along it. It was damp. Condensation was collecting somewhere above and slowly seeping in. In a year or 2, that crack would widen. A piece of the ceiling could collapse right onto the operating room. He told Emily about it. She looked up at the ceiling, then at him. She asked if he could fix it. Dan said that he could, but he'd need materials, epoxy resin, or something similar, and time. Emily nodded. Then she said she had alcohol, medical grade, plenty of it, and that if he ever needed currency in the Hive, alcohol worked better than money. Dan smiled. He said he'd keep that in mind. They started talking, first about the pipes, then about the ventilation in the medical wing, then about how the Hive was set up. Emily knew more than most. She'd been here for 10 years. She'd arrived via evacuation from the U.S. West Coast. She made it to Korea on one of the last transport ships. She lost her husband and son in the first year of the disaster. She didn't say how. Dan didn't ask. She'd been a military doctor even before the disaster, a surgeon, a trauma specialist. She'd been through everything a person could go through. She'd seen everything a person could see. Pragmatic, tough. She spoke her mind. She swore in 2 languages. She smoked synthetic cigarettes made from fungal fibers. They stank. Dan winced. Emily didn't apologize. He told her about the mini-dome, about the strawberries. Emily snorted. She said strawberries were pretty, but she needed antibiotics, dressing supplies, proper lighting in the operating rooms, and at least 1 X-ray machine that works. Dan asked if there was a broken X-ray machine at the Hive. Emily said there were 2. Both had been out of commission for 3 years. No one could fix them. There were no replacement parts. There are no specialists. Dan said he'd take a look. 2 days later, he was sitting in front of the disassembled X-ray machine, thinking. The machine was made in Korea, about 30 years old. Not complicated in design. The problem was with the X-ray generator. The tube was blown. There was nothing to replace it with. But, Dan remembered, there was an entry in the warehouse inventory. Old electron tubes, written off. A box in the lower warehouse. He went downstairs, found the box, sorted through it, found 2 tubes of the right type. Not perfect, but they worked. They could be adapted. 3 days of work, with a soldering iron, with improvised adapters, and a lot of swearing in 2 languages because the wires wouldn't stay in the connectors. On the 4th day, the machine produced its first image. Blurry, fuzzy, but usable. Dan spent 2 more days fine-tuning it. When he was done, the image was legible. Not perfect, but good enough for a diagnosis. He called Emily. She came over. She looked at the image, then at the machine, then at Dan. She was silent for a minute. Then she said she had 3 patients with suspected fractures. She'd been treating them blindly for a year, and that if he'd really fixed this machine, she owed him. Dan said she didn't owe him anything. He said he needed something else. Medical data on Sector 7, incidents, mortality, causes, trends. He needed to understand what was making people sick and causing them to die, so he could set the right priorities. Emily looked at him for a long time. Then she said that no one had ever asked for data like that before. Everyone came for medicine, for help, for a miracle. No one came for statistics. Dan said that statistics are the miracle. If you know what people are dying from, you know what to fix first. Emily snorted. She said he was strange, but she'd give him the data. A week later, Dan was poring over the tables and felt his hands growing cold. The leading causes of death in Hive North 7 over the past 3 years. Respiratory diseases, 34%. Fungal lung infections, mold. The very same mold he'd mentioned on his first day. It was already killing people. Second place, infectious diseases, 22%. Not enough antibiotics, no sterilization. Third place, malnutrition and related complications, 18%. Fourth place, mental disorders, suicides, 12%. Dan set the charts aside. He stood up. He walked over to the wall. He pressed his forehead against it. He stood there for a minute. Then he returned to the table. He took a blank sheet of paper, and he began to write a new plan. Not for 30 days, for 3 months. Ventilation and mold, priority number 1. People are dying from the air. Composting and expanding the winter garden, priority number 2. More food, better food, variety. Medical wing, repairs, expansion, training for orderlies, priority number 3. And the 4th item? An expedition to the surface. Dan wrote that word and underlined it. Surface. The hives are dying. The reactor has 3 to 5 years left. The ventilation system is falling apart. Mold is taking over. It'll get worse every year. The only way out is up. But first, we need to prove that it's possible to live up there. He needs data, pH readings, soil samples, meteorological observations. And for that, we need an expedition. He went to see the colonel. He laid the plan on the table. The colonel read it for 20 minutes, in silence. Then he looked at Dan. He asked if he understood what he was asking for. Every expedition to the surface results in casualties. The last one was 3 months ago. 8 people left, 5 returned. 2 with burns. 1 died a week later. Dan said he understood, but if they didn't go up to the surface within the next 3 months, In 5 years, there would be no one left to go. The colonel was silent. Then he said he'd think about it. Dan returned to his room. It was small, 4 square meters. A bunk, a table, a chair, a lamp. He lay down. He closed his eyes, and he thought that for the first time in his entire life, both lives, he knew exactly why he woke up in the morning. Dan met Emily Park and repaired the X-ray machine in the medical wing. Medical statistics showed that the leading cause of death was respiratory illnesses caused by mold. Dan drew up a 3-month plan that included the first expedition to the surface and presented it to Colonel Seo. The colonel thought it over for 10 days. Dan didn't sit idle during that time. He focused on ventilation. It was the top priority. People were dying from the air, and it had to be stopped right away. His team grew. 30 people became 40. Volunteers came on their own. Rumors about the winter garden and the mini-dome spread throughout the sector. People wanted to be part of something that worked. Dan broke the ventilation task down into sections. 12 critical zones, those very 14 spots of mold, plus areas with elevated CO2 levels. The method was simple. Open the air ducts, clean them out, replace the filter. If there's no filter, make one from whatever's available. Fungal fibers, recycled fabric, compressed paper, not ideal, but better than nothing. They treated the mold with a solution. Dan concocted a formula from available chemicals: hydrogen peroxide, boric acid, baking soda, cheap, effective, non-toxic to humans. The workers watched as he mixed the solution in a bucket and shook their heads. They said there was no escape from mold, that it always comes back. Dan explained, mold comes back because the cause isn't addressed. Mold grows where it's damp and there's no air circulation. Remove the moisture, ensure proper ventilation, and the mold won't come back. A simple principle, but no one here knew it. In 10 days, they cleaned up 6 critical areas. They replaced the filters in 4 heat recovery units. They treated all 14 mold hotspots. CO2 levels in the residential blocks on the lower levels dropped by 20% during the first week. Emily confirmed it. There were fewer reports of respiratory complaints. Not by much, but the trend was clear. Dan kept working and waited for a response from the colonel. The reply came on the 11th day. The colonel summoned him to his office. The office was small. A desk, 2 chairs, a map of Ulya on the wall, a map of the surface nearby. Old, faded, but with markings. Fresh ones. The colonel said he approved the expedition, but with conditions. First, the team must consist of no more than 12 people. Second, the mission must last no more than 72 hours. Third, a military escort. His daughter, Kim Sora, would lead the security detail. Dan looked at the colonel. He asked how old his daughter was. The colonel replied that she was 19. Dan said nothing. It was none of his business. The colonel added that Sora had been commanding the reconnaissance team for 2 years, that she was Sector 7's best marksman, that she knew the terrain better than any of his soldiers. Dan nodded. He accepted it. Preparations for the expedition took 3 weeks. Dan compiled a list of essentials: protective suits, acid-resistant, respirators with double filters, dosimeters for measuring pH, containers for soil samples, measuring instruments, meteorological equipment, tents made of acid-resistant material, water and food for 4 days plus a reserve. Half of the items on the list were missing. Dan improvised. They modified the suits from military coveralls. They coated them with a layer of molten polyethylene. Rough, but it holds the acid. They assembled the respirators from 2 broken ones. One worked. They made the sample containers from old medical containers. Emily stood out. Dan saw Sora for the first time 3 days before the mission. She came into his workspace. Small, thin, short hair, A military uniform a size too big. But her eyes. Her eyes were just like her father's. Cold, attentive, calculating. She introduced herself, said she'd be in charge of security, asked what his requirements were. Dan said he needed 4 hours outdoors to take measurements, that he would choose a spot on site, that his people would be spread out, and that he needed a guarantee that if it started to rain, they would have a maximum of 10 minutes to evacuate to shelter. Sora nodded. She said she would make sure of it. Then she looked at him, intently, as if she were assessing him. She asked if it was true that he had repaired the winter garden in 4 days. Dan said it was true. Sora was silent for a moment. Then she said that her mother had grown roses before the catastrophe, that she remembered the scent, even though she had been only 2 years old at the time, and that if Dan could really grow plants on the surface, she would do everything in her power to ensure his expedition returned with everyone accounted for. Dan looked at her. 19 years old, commander, gunner, soldier. She'd never seen a rose in her life. She only remembered the scent from a time when the world was still alive. He nodded. He said he'd keep the roses in mind. Departure day. 3 months since Dan's arrival at the Hive. 12 people in modified suits stood at the main airlock of Sector 7. Dan, Hyun, 2 engineers from his team, 2 technicians, and 6 of Sora's fighters. Sora herself stood at the front, an assault rifle slung over her shoulder, a respirator hanging from her chin. Ready. The airlock was double, heavy steel doors, rusty around the edges. Between them, a decompression chamber. Beyond the second set of doors, a tunnel, a long one. 200 meters of an inclined ascent to the surface. Colonel Seo stood by the airlock. He looked at his daughter, at Dan. His face was stony. He said one word. Come back. Sora saluted. Dan nodded. The doors opened. Air from the tunnel hit their faces. Warm, damp, with a sour tang, completely different. They walked upward. 200 meters seemed endless. The tunnel walls were wet. The concrete was corroded. Reinforcing bars jutted out in several places, rusty black. Dan ran his hands along the walls as they walked, assessing the extent of the damage. The tunnel had about 5 years left, maybe 7. Then it would collapse. One more reason to hurry. Light up ahead, dim, gray, but it was light, real light, not from a lamp. They'd made it out. Dan stopped on the last step and froze. The sky. He hadn't seen the sky in 40 years, 34 in his past life, the last few of which he'd spent indoors and on construction sites, and who knows how many in this body. The sky was gray, low, heavy clouds the color of wet iron. But it was the sky, the real one, endless, vast. Dan stood and looked. Someone nearby sighed deeply. Haeun. She had never seen the sky, not once in her life. She stood there, tilting her head back, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide. Her hands trembled slightly. Dan saw tears streaming down her cheeks from beneath her respirator. She didn't even notice. Sora quietly ordered them to move. Her voice was steady, professional. But Dan noticed that she too was looking up. For 1 second. 2. Then she lowered her gaze and moved forward. The surface. Dan saw what he'd expected, and what he hadn't expected. He'd expected ruined buildings, rusty skeletons, concrete corroded by acid down to gravel, asphalt that was no longer there, metal structures turned into rust-red sponges, no trees, no grass. The earth was grayish-red, dead. He hadn't expected this. Here and there, something was poking out of cracks in the rocks, thin, pale stems, alive. Plants, not cultivated, wild, having broken through the acidic soil on their own. Dan crouched down. He touched a stem, carefully, alive, real. He took out his testing kit. He took a soil sample. He measured the pH. 4.2. Acidic, but not lethal. Not 2.1 like it was 17 years ago. 4.2. That's the level of an acidic peat bog. Blueberries grow at that pH. Potatoes, some grains. With buffering agents, you can raise it to 5. At a pH of 5, almost everything grows. He took another sample. And another, at different spots. The pH ranged from 3.8 to 4.5. Uneven, in patches, as if someone had treated specific areas with precision. Dan froze. He double-checked the readings. He checked the meter. The meter was working properly. The readings were correct. The pH variation couldn't be natural. Nature evens things out. Rain falls evenly. The soil mixes. The pH should be roughly the same across the entire area. But here, there were patches, distinct, with clear boundaries, as if someone from above had poured a neutralizer onto specific squares. Dan looked up. Gray clouds. Nothing else. He recorded the coordinates of each measurement. Then he collected soil samples. Then he set up a simple weather station. 2 thermometers, a humidity sensor, a rain gauge, all homemade, all made from whatever they could find in Ulya's warehouses. While he was working, his people set up a test plot, 4 acres. They marked out the area. They laid down a buffer layer, crushed limestone from the lower levels of the hive. There was plenty of it, construction waste, trash. To Dan, it was gold. Limestone neutralizes acid, basic chemistry. Spread it over the surface. Mix it into the topsoil. Rain washes the limestone into the soil. The acid is neutralized. The pH rises. Simple. Cheap. It works. Kine was collecting plant samples. Every stem, every root, every leaf. Her hands trembled with excitement. But her movements were precise, careful, professional. Dan watched her and thought he hadn't made a mistake with the assignment. Sora and her fighters held the perimeter. Dan heard her talking on the radio with the lookouts at the entrance into the tunnel. Her voice was calm, clear. 19 years old, a commander. 5 hours into the operation, Sora approached Dan. She said the radar showed a front approaching from the west. Rain would arrive in 40 minutes. They needed to leave. Dan looked up at the sky. The clouds had darkened. The wind had picked up. The sour smell grew sharper. He nodded. He gave the order to pack up. 20 minutes to get ready. They made it. Almost. By the time the last person ducked into the tunnel, the first raindrops were already falling on the rocks. Dan stood at the entrance and watched. A drop fell on a concrete ledge next to his hand. Where the drop hit, the concrete sizzled. A thin wisp of steam rose upward. Dan looked at his glove. There was a wet spot on it. The material held up, but he saw how the fabric had changed color slightly where it had been hit. Acid. Still acid. Weaker than it had been 17 years ago, but strong enough to kill. He stepped back into the tunnel, turned around. He headed down, 200 meters to the airlock. All 12 men had returned, all alive, all unharmed. Colonel Seo stood by the airlock. He was counting the men. 12 had gone, 12 had returned. He looked at his daughter, at Dan, and for the first time since they'd met, he placed his hand on Dan's shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just put his hand there. Then he let go. He turned around and walked away. Dan didn't sleep that night. He sat poring over the samples, over the measurements, over the map, and he thought about the pH irregularities, about the neutralization spots, about the fact that someone or something was already working on purifying the atmosphere. Selectively. And the coordinates the military had given him for the expedition fell exactly within one of those spots. A coincidence. or not? Dan didn't know, but he knew one thing. The surface could be restored. He'd seen it with his own eyes, pale stems pushing through the acidic soil. Life hadn't given up, and he wouldn't give up either. The first expedition to the surface was a success, and all 12 people returned alive. Dan discovered that the soil's pH had dropped to 4, and that plants were pushing through the soil on their own. He also noticed irregularities in the neutralization, appearing as distinct patches, which indicated an external, targeted influence on the atmosphere. Dan returned from the surface a different man. Not on the outside, inside. He had seen the sky. He had seen the earth. He had seen life breaking through the acid. And now he knew that the plan was not a theory. The plan was real. But a wall stood between knowledge and action, a political one. The day after the expedition, Colonel Seo summoned him to a Sector 7 council meeting. 7 people sat at a long table, members Ulia's civilian administration, the people who distributed food, water, electricity, living quarters, the people who decided who would receive antibiotics and who would have to wait. The colonel introduced Dan. He presented the expedition's findings. He showed soil samples. He showed the pH readings. He showed photographs of plants pushing through the soil. The council listened in silence. Then the questions began. The first question was asked by Senior Advisor Moon, a thin man in his 60s with thin lips and attentive eyes. He asked how many people Dan planned to bring to the surface. Dan replied that building the Alpha Dome would require 120 people for 3 months, then another 200 for operations. Moon nodded. Then he asked where Dan proposed to get 120 workers. Of the Hive's population of 12,000, 3,000 are children, 2,000 are elderly or sick, 4,000 are employed in life support. Every person counts. Taking 120 people would weaken critical systems. Dan replied that he was proposing a rotation system. 30 people on the surface for 2 weeks, then a shift change. 4 crews. Each works for 2 weeks and rests for 6. The strain on the hive would be minimal. Moon nodded again. Then he asked the third question, the most important one. He asked what would happen if the project failed, if people died, if resources were wasted. Who would be held accountable? Silence. Dan looked Moon in the eye. He said he would take responsibility, personally. Moon leaned back in his chair. He looked at the other advisors. The vote was 5-2. The project was approved. Conditionally, for 3 months. If there were no results in 3 months, the project would be shut down. Resources would be returned. Dan would accept the consequences. Dan walked out of the room and exhaled. 3 months, 90 days. Build the Alpha Dome in 90 days. In his past life, a project of this scale would have taken a year and a half. But in his past life, he hadn't been building with trash on acidic soil, with workers who didn't know what a percentage was. Preparation took 2 weeks. Dan worked 20 hours a day. He slept on the floor of the workshop. He ate when he remembered to. Haeun brought him food and silently set it on the table. Sometimes he'd look up and see her sitting across from him, reading his notes, checking his calculations, looking for mistakes. She found 2, minor ones, but she found them. Dan looked at her in surprise. She shrugged and said he was a quick learner. The plan for Dome Alpha was as follows. The site was 4 acres, the very same one, where they'd laid the buffer layer during the first expedition. The limestone had been working for 2 weeks already. The pH of the topsoil had risen from 4.2 to 4.7, slowly but steadily. The dome's framework, Fuller's geodesic structure, Triangular panels. Dan didn't choose it out of a love for aesthetics. A geodesic dome is the strongest structure with minimal material usage. It resists wind. It distributes the load evenly, ideal for an acidic environment. The frame material? Sulfur concrete. Dan grinned when he came up with this. Sulfur concrete instead of Portland cement. In the ordinary world, this is exotic. In an acidic world, it's the ideal material. Sulfur concrete doesn't react with acid. It's essentially made of it. There was sulfur in the hive, a byproduct of filtration. Tons of sulfur lay in the lower warehouses as waste. To Dan, it was a building material. The dome's covering, several layers of polyethylene film. Transparent. It lets light through. Between the layers is a buffer solution, a thin layer of liquid with a high pH. Rainwater hits the outer layer. The acid is neutralized by the buffer between the layers. Clean water passes through to the inside. Dan drew a diagram and showed it to Hyun. She looked at it for 5 minutes. Then she said it was genius. Dan said it wasn't genius. It's engineering. Genius is when you can't explain how it works. Engineering is when you can explain it to anyone in 10 minutes. Inside the dome, soil treated with buffer additives, hydroponic racks along the perimeter, a central zone for soil-based cultivation, a rainwater collection system, a neutralization cascade, and 3 stages of filtration. The output is clean water suitable for irrigation and drinking. Maggie showed up on the 3rd day of preparations. Dan hadn't known she existed until that moment. The colonel brought her in personally. Tall, red hair, freckles, broad shoulders. Her hands were covered in calluses and scars. She spoke English with a Texas accent. She swore in every other sentence. The colonel introduced her as Margaret O'Brien, a former NASA engineer, a life support systems specialist. She'd made her way to Korea 4 years ago on a dilapidated ship from Hawaii. She'd lived in Sector 4, worked as a mechanic, repaired generators. The colonel had transferred her to Sector 7, specifically for Dan's project. Maggie looked at Dan, from head to toe. She was a head taller than him. She asked if it was true that he was planning to build a geodesic dome out of sulfur concrete on the acid wasteland. Dan confirmed it. Maggie was silent for a moment. Then she said that this was either the best idea she'd heard in 10 years or the worst, and that she wasn't sure which one it was. But she wanted to find out. Dan handed her the blueprints. Maggie took them. She read for 20 minutes, in silence. Then she looked up. Her eyes were ablaze. She said she'd found 4 errors in the load-bearing structure calculations, and that the water collection system was too complicated. It could be simpler. Dan sat down next to her. They argued for 3 hours. Haeun listened. She didn't understand half the terms, but she saw the big picture. The 2 engineers had found each other. They spoke the same language. They interrupted each other. They drew over each other's diagrams. They laughed at their own mistakes. Maggie was learning Korean. She wasn't very good at it. She mixed up the tones. Once, she addressed a soldier using a word that meant something indecent instead of please. The soldier blushed and ran away. Dan explained. Maggie laughed so loudly it could be heard 2 levels up. Then she learned that word on purpose and used it as a curse word. Construction began in the 6th week after their return from the surface. The first crew, 30 people. Dan went with them. Haeun went with them. Maggie went with them. Sora and her fighters went with them. Exit through the tunnel. 200 meters up. Gray sky. Sour wind. And the clearing. 4 acres of cultivated land. The buffer layer was working. The soil's pH had reached 4.9, almost 5. Dan took a sample and smiled. Day 1. Marking out. Stakes. Ropes. Dan personally drove in the first stake, wearing gloves, wearing a respirator, under the gray sky. The hammer striking the stake sounded like a gunshot in the silence of a dead world. Haeun stood nearby. She was recording the coordinates. Her hands were no longer shaking. Day 2. The foundation. Sulfur concrete. Dan showed the crew how to mix it. Sulfur melts at 120 degrees. It's mixed with aggregate. It sets in a matter of hours, not days, like Portland cement. Fast, cheap, acid-resistant. The workers watched as the gray mass set and hardened right before their eyes. Someone said it was like magic. Dan replied that it was chemistry. The melting point of sulfur is 129.0 degrees Celsius. Nothing magical about it. The man who had mentioned magic looked at Dan, then at the hardening concrete, then back at Dan, and for the first time all day, he smiled. By the end of the second week, the foundation was ready. By the end of the fourth week, the ready was half built. Triangular panels of sulfur concrete rose above the barren earth like the ribs of an unseen creature. Dan stood to the side and watched. Maggie walked over. She stood beside him, silently. Then she said that the last time she'd seen anything like this was when she was working on the lunar base project at NASA. Dan looked at her. He asked what had become of the project. Maggie said it had been shut down a year before the disaster. Budget cuts. Dan grunted. He said there were no more budget cuts. Maggie laughed. Then she looked at the dome's framework, then at the barren ground around it, then at the gray sky, and she said quietly that for the first time in 10 years, she felt like an engineer and not a mechanic who fixes other people's breakdowns. Dan didn't say anything. He just stood there beside her. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. The Sector 7 Council approved the Alpha Dome project on the condition that results be demonstrated within 3 months. Dan developed a construction plan using sulfur concrete and a rain neutralization buffer system. Maggie O joined the team Brian, a former NASA engineer, and construction of the framework began on the surface. In the 6th week of construction, a man died. Lee Junho, 28 years old, a technician from the 2nd Brigade. The wall of the unfinished technical block next to the dome collapsed. Junho was standing at the base, checking the masonry. The wall cracked and collapsed. 2 metric tons of sulfur concrete. He didn't have time to get out of the way. Sora heard the crash first. She ran over in seconds, but there was nothing she could do. Junho died instantly. Dan stood over the body, unable to breathe. He had designed this module himself. He'd calculated the load himself. He'd approved the blueprints himself. Maggie approached. She looked at the debris, then at Dan. She said quietly that the wall hadn't collapsed because of the calculations. The calculations were correct. The ground had subsided. There was a cavity under the foundation, an old drainage pipe from before the war, which wasn't on the map. The soil around the pipe had been washed away. The foundation had settled 3 centimeters. The wall had warped. The load had shifted. A crack, a collapse. Dan listened. He understood that Maggie was right, that it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known about a pipe that wasn't on any map. But understanding didn't help. A man was dead. His man, from his team, on his construction site. That evening, Dan sat alone in the dome's technical compartment. His head was bowed. His hands hung between his knees. He wasn't crying. He just sat there. Staring at the floor, he thought about how, in his past life, over 15 years of working on construction sites, he'd lost 3 people. Every time, it had been unbearable. Every time, he'd thought he'd get used to it. He never did. Never. Emily came to see him that night, uninvited, without knocking. She just walked in, sat down next to him, silently. 10 minutes later, Dan spoke. He said that one of his men had died today, that he was responsible for everyone on this construction site, that the man had trusted him, had come to the surface because he believed in him, and that now his body was being carried back to the hive in a body bag. Emily listened. Then she said that in her 10 years as a doctor at the hive, she had lost 412 patients, that she remembered every single one, that the names were written down in a notebook, that the notebook lay under her pillow, that for the first 2 years she couldn't sleep. Then she learned to, not because she got used to it, because she understood. You can't help the dead if you die of insomnia yourself. Dan looked at her. She was staring straight ahead. Her face was calm. Her eyes were dry. She had cried out everything she could a long time ago. Dan asked what her son's name was. Emily fell silent for a long time. Then she said, Junho. His name was Junho. He was 4. He loved to draw the sun, a yellow circle with rays shooting out in all directions. The sun was in every drawing. She fell silent again. Dan didn't say anything. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't say he understood, because he didn't. He'd lost a worker. She'd lost a son. These were different universes of pain. He just sat there beside her, and Emily sat beside him, until morning. In the morning, Dan got up. He washed his face. He went out to the crew. They were standing there, looking at him. 30 people, silent, waiting. Ha-in stood at the front. Her eyes were red. Maggie stood with her arms crossed. Her face was heavy. Sora stood with an assault rifle behind her back. Her gaze was inscrutable. Dan looked at them. He said that Lee Won-ho had died during the construction of the Alpha Dome, that his death weighed on his conscience, that he would do everything to ensure it never happened again, that from this day forward, before each construction phase, the site would be checked for underground cavities, that not a single foundation would be laid without a soil survey, and that if anyone wanted to leave the project, he would understand and not judge them. Silence. Then Jung, the very same guy who didn't know what a percentage was, he stepped forward. He said that Won-ho was his friend, that Won-ho believed in the dome, that he wouldn't walk away. The rest remained silent. No one left. Not a single person. Construction continued, more slowly, more carefully. Dan added a mandatory geological survey step before laying each foundation. Maggie devised a simple method, a long metal rod driven into the ground every meter. If the rod sank, it meant there was a cavity. Simple, rough, but it worked. They found 3 more cavities over the next week. They worked their way around them, filled them in, reinforced them. By the 8th week, the dome's framework was complete. The geodesic dome stood on barren ground, gray concrete on gray soil under a gray sky. But the shape was beautiful, mathematically precise. Every triangle in its place, every node at the correct angle. Dan stood and watched. Maggie walked over. She said it was the best structure she'd ever built in her life, including at NASA. Dan said she'd had better materials at NASA. Maggie said she hadn't had better people at NASA. Covering the dome took another 2 weeks. Polyethylene film, 3 layers, a buffer solution between the layers. They worked carefully. Every seam was checked 3 times. One hole, and acid rain would get inside. Haeun oversaw the interior work, the soil, the shelving, the irrigation systems. She was no longer the quiet girl from the 3rd shift. She commanded 20 people and did so naturally, as if she'd been doing this her whole life. Dan watched and thought that some people don't need self-confidence. They need an opportunity. Give them an opportunity and confidence will follow. By the 10th week, Dome Alpha was sealed. The frame, the covering, the buffer system, the water collection system, everything was in place. The most important part remained. Start it up, plant it, and wait. The first rain after the dome was sealed came 3 days later, heavy. acidic. The drops pounded against the outer layer of the film like handfuls of gravel. Everyone stood inside and looked up. The film held. The buffer was working. Between the layers, the liquid changed color as it neutralized, from clear to cloudy white. Acid went in. Neutral water came out. It flowed down the inner gutters into the collection tank. Dan held his palm under the stream of water from the tank. Clear, odorless. He measured the pH. 6.8, almost neutral. He showed his palm to Hyun. Wet, clean. Hyun looked at the water, then at the rain outside the dome's wall, then at Dan. She said she didn't believe it. Dan said she didn't have to believe it. It was enough to measure the pH. Hyun laughed. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, she laughed out loud. Loudly. Freely. Maggie stood nearby and smiled. Widely, showing all her teeth. She held both palms under the water and splashed herself in the face. Then she snorted and said the water was better than at NASA. Sora stood by the entrance, her rifle slung over her shoulder. She looked at the rain outside, then at the water inside. Her face was expressionless, but Dan saw her clenching and unclenching her fist, quickly, nervously, like someone holding back an emotion too strong to show in. He turned away. He didn't look. Some moments belong only to the one who experiences them. Technician Lee Won-ho died when a wall collapsed in unknown underground cavity. Dan experienced his first loss in this new world and instituted mandatory geological surveys prior to construction. The Alpha Dome was completed and successfully passed the acid rain test, with the water fully neutralized by the buffer system. The first crop in Dome Alpha ripened in the 4th month. Tomatoes. Real red tomatoes, grown in soil under natural light filtering through the dome's translucent covering. Hyun personally tended to this garden bed, checking on it every day. She adjusted the watering. She applied fertilizer made from compost, which was now being produced by the Hive using Dan's system by the ton. When the first tomato turned red, she went to Dan and said one word. Ready. Dan went with her. He stood in front of the garden bed, a small bush, 3 tomatoes, red. Not perfect. One was crooked, another had a crack. The third was as small as a walnut. But they were red, real, alive. He picked one, held it out to Han. She shook her head, said he should be the first to try it. Dan didn't argue. He took a bite. Sour, watery. Not the best tomato of his life. Probably the worst, taste-wise. But he chewed and thought it was the most important tomato on the planet, because it grew on the surface, on land that had been considered dead for 17 years, under a sky that had been killing everything alive for 17 years. It had grown. The news spread throughout the Hive within hours. Tomatoes on the surface. Real tomatoes. Not mushroom paste, not algae concentrate, tomatoes. To the people of the Hive, that word sounded like something out of a fairy tale. Most had never seen a tomato. They didn't know what it tasted like. They knew only from the elders' descriptions. Red, round, sour, juicy. Delegations poured in. Colonel Seo brought his advisors. Then people from other sectors arrived. Then just ordinary residents. A line formed at the tunnel entrance. Sora stepped up security. Not everyone who came was friendly. Advisor Moon came in person. He looked at the garden beds. He touched a tomato leaf. He sniffed it. He stood there in silence for a long time. Then he turned to Dan and said that the 3-month deadline was being extended indefinitely, that the project would receive additional resources, and that the council was asking Dan to prepare an expansion plan. Dan nodded. He was already working on it. The plan to expand to 200 acres was sitting in his room. It was biding its time. Now the time had come. Something else happened that same week. A group of refugees arrived at the Hive. 11 people, from the devastated Sector 9. Among them was a young woman, 24 years old, thin, short hair, dark eyes. She introduced herself as Yuna, a self-taught engineer. She asked for shelter and a job. Colonel Seo accepted the group. Standard procedure: quarantine, screening, assignment. Yuna was assigned to Dan's team. She came to see him the day after quarantine ended. She introduced herself. Quiet, polite, composure. Every movement precise. Every gesture economical. Like someone accustomed to controlling herself. Always. Dan looked at her. Something caught his attention. He couldn't say what. Intuition. In 15 years of managing people, he'd learned to sense when something was off. Yuna was different, but he couldn't figure out exactly what it was. He brushed it off. He put her to work. Yuna turned out to be useful. She learned quickly. She picked things up on the fly. She worked in silence. A lot. She didn't complain. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. A week later, Dan noticed that she was memorizing the layout of all the dome's key systems. The pumping station, the filters, the water collection tank, the electrical system. Dan took note of this. He didn't think much of it. An engineer should know where everything is. That's normal. Or maybe not. The expansion of Dome Alpha was in full swing. 200 acres. Not just one dome, but a cluster. A large central dome, 4 smaller ones surrounding it, connected by covered walkways. Each small dome was specialized. The first for grains, the second for vegetables, the third for industrial crops. The fourth was residential. Yes, residential. Dan suggested to the colonel that they begin the resettlement. 50 people. The first permanent residents of the surface in 17 years. The colonel thought about it for 3 days. He agreed. There turned out to be 10 times as many volunteers as there were spots. People wanted to go up. They wanted to see the sky. They wanted to breathe air that smelled not of ozone and rust, but of earth and greenery. Dan selected them personally. The criteria were simple: health, skills, and a willingness to work. And one more: children. Dan gave priority to families with children. Children had to see the sky. Anna Lynn came to see him on the day they announced the call for volunteers. She stood in the doorway of his office. She was short. She had warm eyes. A ukulele was slung over her back. She said she wanted to move her school to the surface, all 26 students. She teaches them using photographs of trees and the sky. She shows them pictures from 30 years ago and tells them what the world used to look like. The children believe her, but she feels like a fraud because she herself didn't believe the world would return until today. Dan looked at her. He asked if she'd seen the Alpha Dome. Anna said no, that she was afraid of seeing it and being disappointed. Dan stood up. He said, "Let's go." They walked through the tunnel together, 200 meters upward. Anna was silent. She clutched the strap of her ukulele with both hands. When they emerged onto the surface, she stopped. The sky wasn't gray that day. The clouds had parted, for the first time in a week. Light streamed in at an angle through the gaps in the clouds. Not the sun, not full light, but light. Real light, not from a lamp. Anna stood there. She looked up, then down. At the green patches inside the dome visible through the translucent covering, then to the sides, at the frames of the small domes, at the people who were working, carrying bags, laying panels, laughing, talking, on the surface, under the sky. She turned to Dan. Her eyes were wet. She said she'd take her children, all of them, tomorrow. Dan said tomorrow was too soon. The residential dome would be ready in 2 weeks. Anna said she'd wait. Then she smiled. And Dan thought that this smile held a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. The warmth of a person who lives not for themselves, but for the 26 children who had entrusted their view of the world to her. He went back to work, but he remembered that smile. That evening, Hyun came to him with the soil report. They sat side by side, looking at the charts. The pH in the treated areas had reached 5.2. Hyun said that with a pH like that, they could plant potatoes, beans, cabbage, even wheat if they could find seeds. Dan nodded. Then he looked at her. She was sitting close, closer than usual. Her shoulder was almost touching his. She smelled of earth, of greenery, of sweat, the honest sweat of a person who works with their hands. Dan thought it was the best smell on the planet. Then he pulled himself together. He was the project manager. She was his subordinate. He had 200 acres under construction, 12,000 lives under his responsibility. Not the time, not the place. He moved back a centimeter. Haeun noticed. She didn't say anything. She just lowered her head slightly. And Dan regretted that centimeter. But he didn't move back. The first tomato harvest in Dome Alpha was a turning point, and the project received indefinite funding. Yuna arrived at the Hive posing as a refugee, and Dan began to sense that something was off about her. Anna Lynn asked to have her school moved to the surface, and a feeling began to grow between Dan and Haeun, one he was still holding back. The 6th month. Dome Alpha was operating at full capacity, 200 acres, 5 domes, the central one and 4 smaller ones, 200 permanent residents. Among them were 26 children from Anna's school. They ran along the dirt paths between the garden beds and squealed with delight. Some fell to their knees and touched the ground with their hands. Real soil, not a concrete floor. Soil from which real plants grow. Anna stood among them, with a ukulele. She was playing something quiet and cheerful. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. Dan watched this from the roof of the technical block. Maggie stood beside him. They were silent. Then Maggie said she hadn't believed she'd live to see this day. That 4 years ago, when she sailed into Korea on a leaky boat, she'd thought humanity was over, that engineering was dead, that everything she'd learned at MIT and NASA was meaningless, that she'd just be fixing generators until she died. Dan looked at her. Maggie was looking at the children below. Her eyes were shining. She blinked quickly. She turned away. She said she had something in her eye. Dan didn't comment. The reservoir. That was the next project. Maggie had been passionate about it ever since the design phase. Dan gave her full control. Design, construction, all decisions were hers. Maggie worked like a woman possessed, 14 hours a day. She drew up blueprints, calculated volumes, argued with material suppliers, argued with the workers, argued with Dan when he suggested simplifying the design. The reservoir was her brainchild, a 500,000-liter tank, walls made of sulfur-reinforced concrete, the bottom waterproofed with recycled polyethylene, a filling system via a cascade of neutralizers, 3 stages of purification, drinking water at the outlet. Maggie designed every element herself. Dan checked the calculations. He found one mistake. Maggie argued for 2 hours. Then she admitted he was right. Then she called him a name that Dan didn't bother to translate for those around him. During those same weeks, Dan began work on a project that wasn't listed on any plan, a peach orchard, for Hyun. He found the seeds in an underground storage facility, an old one, pre-war, sealed off. The facility was discovered by accident during the expansion of the tunnels, a concrete chamber behind an airtight door. Inside, shelves lined with containers, seeds, hundreds of varieties. Most had perished, moisture had seeped in, mold, but some had survived. Among them was a labeled container, peach, Prunus persica. Dan took the container. He opened it. 23 seeds, sealed in vacuum packaging, intact. He tested their germination rate. Out of 23, 20 sprouted, a phenomenal result for seeds that were at least 17 years old. He planted them in a separate section of the small dome. He didn't tell anyone why, not even Hyun. As he was creating, a threat was growing. Dan learned about it from Colonel Seo, the COMPSAT-7 satellite, an old Korean reconnaissance satellite, one of the few still operating in orbit. Several hives were receiving its data, and now a patch of green was visible in the images, where for 17 years there had been a gray wasteland. A green spot, Arcadia, visible from space. The colonel said that neighboring hives had already noticed it. South 3, beneath what used to be Seoul, the largest hive on the peninsula, a population of 40,000. The South 3 Depth Council was headed by Chairman Han Doyun. The colonel knew him personally. He said Han was smart, cautious, tough. His power was based on control of resources, on scarcity. If people find out that they can live and grow food on the surface, they'll leave. Han's rule will end. That's what makes Han dangerous. Dan asked what exactly he expected from Han. The colonel replied, sabotage, espionage, and attempts to steal the technology or destroy it. Dan thought of Yuna, the quiet, composed young woman who, in 2 weeks, had memorized the layout of every critical system in the dome. He told the colonel that it might already be too late. The colonel looked at him, asked who he was referring to. Dan described her. The colonel nodded, said he'd look into it. Yuna continued working. Quietly, efficiently, flawlessly. Too flawlessly. Dan watched her from a distance, without giving himself away. And he waited. The 8th month, the first thunderstorm over Dome Alpha. A real thunderstorm. Wind, lightning, a downpour. The buffer system was running at full capacity. The neutralizer between the coating layers changed color so quickly it seemed alive. Acid went in, pure water came out. Liters. Dozens of liters. Hundreds. Dan made a decision. Crazy, or brilliant, or both. He opened the dome's airlock. All 200 residents gathered inside. Dan stood by the open airlock. Behind him lay the buffer fields, a 50-meter-wide strip of treated soil surrounding the dome. The rain that had passed through the buffer fields fell onto this soil already neutralized. Not completely, but enough. A pH of 5.4, safe for the skin, safe for the eyes, safe. He stepped out first. No respirator, no suit, just his regular clothes. He turned his face toward the rain. Water. Pure water from the sky, on his skin, cold, fresh, alive. People watched him from the airlock. They were silent. Then Haeun stepped out second. She stood next to him. She held out her palms. Water ran down her fingers. She laughed, through her tears. Then the rest came out, one by one. 200 people in the rain, without umbrellas, without respirators, for the first time in their lives for most of them. Children squealed. They jumped in the puddles. They caught raindrops with their mouths. The adults stood there. Some laughed, some were crying. Someone fell to his knees and scooped up a puddle with his hands. An old man in his 70s, a veteran, a former soldier. He brought the water to his face and stared at it for a long time. Then he drank it. Emily stood off to the side. She lit her last synthetic cigarette, took a drag. She looked at the rain, at the people, at the children. Then she threw the pack into the mud, stomped it out with her boot. She didn't smoke anymore. Maggie stood in the rain, arms outstretched, head thrown back, mouth open. She was screaming something at the sky, in English, incoherent, joyful, wild. Sora stood a little to the side. She took off her uniform cap, slowly, carefully. She pressed it to her chest. She turned her face toward the rain. Her wet hair stuck to her forehead. Her eyes were closed. Her face wore an expression Dan had never seen on it before. Peace. Anna sat on the wet ground. with a ukulele. She was playing. The strings were out of tune from the water. The sound was warped and wet and off-key, and it was the best sound Dan had ever heard in his life. Yuna stood in the far corner, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying, for the first since childhood. Dan saw it, and in that moment, he realized that no matter who Yuna was, no matter who had sent her, she had just broken down. Not from the pressure, from the beauty. Dan stood in the middle of 200 wet, laughing, crying people. In the rain. In real rain, which, for the first time in 17 years, wasn't killing anyone. And he thought, this is what it was all for. The Alpha Dome had reached full capacity with 200 residents. Dan had discovered a pre-war seed vault and launched a secret project to create a peach orchard for Han. The colonel warned of a threat from South 3, and Dan suspected Yuna. The first neutralized rain became a turning point when 200 people stood under pure rain for the first time in their lives. After the rain, everything changed. Not technically. Technically, everything was going according to plan. It changed inside the people. 200 people stood in the rain and something clicked. The fear went away. Not completely, but it receded. People who had feared the surface for 17 years suddenly realized that the surface could be reclaimed, that it wasn't a fairy tale, not a promise, a fact. They stood in the rain, and they didn't die. There were so many volunteers that Colonel Seo was forced to implement a waiting list. 1,200 people signed up for resettlement in the first week after the rain. Every 10th of Ulya's residents. Dan couldn't take everyone. Not yet. Expansion was underway. New domes, new plots. But it was impossible to build any faster than they were already building. Materials were limited. People were only partially trained. Each new dome took a month of work. He drew up a schedule. By the end of the first year, 1,500 acres, 4 full-size domes, 800 permanent surface residents. Ambitious, but realistic, if nothing went wrong. Something went wrong in the third week after the rain. At night, the Dome Alpha pumping station, the main one, the one that pumps neutralized water from the collection tanks into the distribution system. Without it, there's no irrigation, no drinking water, no dome. Dan woke up to a ring. Chong. His voice was shaking. The pump had stopped. The water wasn't flowing. Dan got dressed in 30 seconds. He ran through the tunnel, 200 meters uphill, gasping for breath, cursing his scrawny body. He reached the pump room in 12 minutes. Maggie was already there, in her pajamas, with a flashlight. Her face was contorted with rage. The pump hadn't stopped on its own. Someone had shut it down. Someone had closed the main valve, by hand, and disabled the auto-start system. Neatly, professionally. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Maggie said the damage was reversible. 2 hours of work, maybe 3. Dan wasn't listening. He was staring at the valve, at the neat tool marks, at the lack of fingerprints. Gloves. The person was wearing gloves. A professional. He called Sora. She arrived 10 minutes later, with 2 officers. She surveyed the scene. Silently. Her face was stony. Then she looked at Dan. She said 12 people had access to the pump room. She'd check each one. Dan nodded. He already knew who'd done it. Or so he thought. Yuna had been working in the pump room 3 days ago. Officially. On schedule. She had access. She had the know-how. She had the skills. And she had that very precision in every movement that had caught his eye on the first day. The precision of someone trained to act unnoticed. Colonel Seo confirmed his suspicions the next day. His people had checked. The refugees from Sector 9 who had come with Yuna were genuine. Yuna was not. Sector 9 had never had anyone named Cho Yuna on its records. She had come from outside. The question was, where from? The colonel said he didn't want to guess. He wanted to know. He suggested arresting her, interrogating her. Dan asked him to wait. The colonel looked at him. He asked why. Dan said that if Yuna were arrested, her handlers would send someone else, someone they wouldn't recognize. It's better to know who the enemy is and keep an eye on them than to take this one out and end up with a new, unknown one. The colonel thought about it. Then he nodded. He said it was wise. But if Yuna tried anything serious, he wouldn't wait. Dan agreed. Sora set up surveillance. 2 operatives took turns on watch. Yuna worked as usual, quietly, efficiently, unaware, or perhaps aware but not letting on. Dan couldn't say for sure. At the same time, Park Hyunsu struck a blow, not a physical one, but a political one. He filed an official complaint with the Sector 7 Council, against Dan, against the project, over the waste of resources. The complaint was well written. Park had worked in the system for 30 years. He knew how it worked. He didn't attack the idea. He attacked the numbers. Energy consumption for the Alpha Dome project had increased by 12% over the past 2 months. That meant the rest of the Hive systems were getting less. Material consumption, gray, polyethylene, chemicals, was all going to the surface. And ventilation in sections 3 and 7 was still operating at 70% capacity. Park didn't say the project was bad. He said the project was coming at the expense of the people who remained below. That Dan was building a paradise on the surface while people in the Hive were coughing from mold. That hurt. Because it was partly true. Dan read the complaint and realized that Park was right. Not entirely, but in part. He had indeed diverted resources to the surface. The ventilation in the lower sections was indeed lagging behind. Not critically, but it was lagging. He went to see Park, for the first time since that day in the winter garden. Park was sitting in his office, a small one, cluttered with papers. On the wall was a photograph of the Hive during its early years of construction. A young Park in the photograph, strong, confident, 20 years ago. Dan sat down across from him. He said he'd read the complaint. He said Park was right, partially. That he'd skewed the distribution of resources and that it needed to be corrected. And that he needed Park's help. Park looked at him, silently. His eyes were skeptical, wary. Dan continued. He said that Park knew the Hive better than anyone alive. 30 years, every tunnel, every pipe, every valve. Dan knows how to build on the surface. Park knows how to sustain life underground. They don't need to compete. They need to work together. Park was silent for a long time. Then he asked what exactly Dan was proposing. Dan proposed a division of labor. Park would be fully responsible for the Hive's 10, ventilation, water, energy, everything internal. Dan would be responsible for the surface. Resources would be distributed according to an agreed-upon schedule. Neither side takes more than what was agreed upon. Park thought. Then he said he wanted the right of veto. If the distribution of resources threatens the Hive's life support, he can halt supplies to the surface. Dan agreed, without hesitation. Park blinked. He had expected an argument, a negotiation, not instant agreement. Dan stood up. He held out his hand. Park looked at the hand, then at Dan. Then he shook it, firmly, dryly, without a smile. But he shook it. It wasn't peace. It was a truce. But a truce is better than war. Dan returned to work. Ahead lay new domes, new people, new problems. And somewhere in the shadows, Yuna was biding her time. Far to the south, beneath what used to be Seoul, Chairman Han Doyun looked at satellite images of the green spot and thought about how the world was changing, and how those changes were deadly dangerous to him. The 9th month. Arcadia was growing. Anna had come up with that name. She was sitting on the porch of a residential dome one evening, playing the ukulele. The children were asleep inside. Dan walked by. He stopped. Anna said she'd been reading to the children about Arcadia, an ancient Greek land where people lived among nature in peace and tranquility. She said that this, right here, was Arcadia. Dan looked at the domes, at the greenery beyond the transparent walls, at the gray sky overhead. He said that peace was far away. Anna smiled and said that peace isn't a place. Peace is an intention. The name stuck within a week. Arcadia. 1,500 acres by the end of the first year. 4 full-size domes. 800 permanent residents. Everything was on schedule. Everything went according to plan. Except for one thing. Raiders. They arrived at the beginning of the 10th month. Not an army, a gang. 40 people, armed, from the ruins south of Arcadia. Not directly from South 3. Mercenaries, vagabonds, people who lived on the surface among the ruins. They ate whatever they could find. They killed for food. Acid rain had burned away everything human in them. They didn't attack because the Khan ordered them to. They attacked because they saw greenery. They saw water. They saw what they didn't have. The first strike came at night. They breached the outer perimeter. They set fire to the buffer field in the southern sector. They cut through 3 panels of the small dome's covering. Acidic air poured inside. There were 32 people in that dome. 10 children. Sora mobilized the garrison in 4 minutes. Her fighters repelled the attack in 20 minutes. The raiders retreated. But the damage was done. 3 dome panels were destroyed. The southern buffer field was on fire. Acid fumes were drifting toward the residential dome. Dan hadn't slept. He was in the command center, coordinating, not the battle, the evacuation. 32 people from the damaged dome, through the tunnel to the central dome. 10 children. Anna was leading them by the hand, 2 by 2, calmly, without panic. She sang them a song as they walked, softly, so they wouldn't be afraid. Dan could hear her on the radio. Maggie was repairing the covering, in the dark, under the open sky. It wasn't raining, but the air was acrid. She worked in a respirator and a hazmat suit. 3 hours. She sealed the tear, roughly, temporarily, but airtight. When she returned inside, her hands were shaking from exhaustion. She sat down on the floor and said that if she ever had to weld polyethylene again at -5 in an acidic mist, she'd personally go out and kill every raider with her bare hands. Dan looked at her. He said he appreciated her enthusiasm, but would prefer a defensive strategy. Maggie snorted. Defense. Dan had about it from day one. But resources were being spent on construction, on growth, on life, not on war. Now there was no choice. He needed someone who understood defense systems, someone who could think like an attacker, someone who knew the weak spots. He went to Yuna. Yes, to Yuna. Sora decided he'd lost his mind. Colonel Seo raised an eyebrow. Emily said he was an idiot. Dan said, listen, Yuna knows how to hack into the system. She's already done it. She knows every weak spot in Arcadia because she studied them to destroy them. There's no one better suited to design defenses than someone who knows how to attack. But first, we need to talk to her. He found Yuna in the technical bay. She was working alone, sorting through filters. Dan walked in, closed the door, and sat down across from her. Yuna looked at him. Her eyes were wary. Her body was tense, ready to flee or strike. Dan said he knew who she was, that he knew where she came from, that he knew why. Yuna didn't move. Her expression didn't change. Only her pupils dilated slightly. Dan continued. He said they'd repaired the pumping station in 2 hours, that it had been a test, not a real attack, that she hadn't carried out a real attack, although she could have. She'd had 3 months. She knew every system. She could have destroyed the water supply, poisoned it, blown it up. She didn't. Yuna remained silent. Dan asked why. Silence. A long one. Then Yuna spoke, quietly. Her voice was steady. She said she'd been sent from South 3, that Chairman Han personally selected the agents, that her mission was reconnaissance, and, if necessary, sabotage of critical systems, that she'd been preparing an attack on the pumping station, a complete, irreversible one. But she couldn't do it. Dan asked why. Yuna looked at her hands. Then she said she'd seen him hauling bags of biochar at night alongside the workers, how he laughed, how he explained to a child what a rainbow was, that in South 3 they'd told her Arcadia was a military project, a territorial takeover, that Dan was building a base for expansion, that he was dangerous. And then she saw 200 people standing in the rain, crying with joy. And she couldn't do it. Dan nodded. Then he said choice. Option 1, he hands her over to the colonel. Arrest, interrogation, possibly deportation to South 3. Option 2, she stays, but not as an agent, as a security engineer, designing Arcadia's defenses, using her knowledge not for destruction, but for protection. Yuna looked at him, silently, for a long time. Then she asked why he trusted her. Dan replied that he didn't trust her. Not yet. Trust has to be earned. But he'd seen her crying in the rain, and he believed that a person who cries at the sight of beauty isn't capable of destroying it. Yuna lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled. Once. Then she straightened up. She looked at Dan. She said she was choosing the second option. Dan stood up. He said that tomorrow morning she would have access to the complete plan for Arcadia, and that Sora would be there, just in case. Yuna nodded. She accepted. Sora was furious. It was the quiet, cold fury of a soldier who believes the commander's decision is wrong. She went to Dan. She said he was risking 3,000 lives for the sake of a single traitor. Dan replied that he was taking the risk because without a defense, those 3,000 lives were already in danger, and that Yuna knew the attacking side better than anyone else. Sora clenched her teeth. She said that if Yuna made a move, she would kill her before she had a chance to do anything. Dan said he had no doubt. Yuna set to work. A week later, she presented Dan with a defense plan for Arcadia. Dan read it and felt a chill run down his spine. Yuna had identified 23 vulnerabilities in the existing infrastructure. Each one, if exploited skillfully, could destroy an entire dome. 23. Dan hadn't seen a single one. Maggie hadn't seen a single one. Yuna saw them all, because she was looking through the eyes of someone who had come to destroy. She proposed a system of walls, perimeter walls, made of sulfur concrete, with observation points, traps, and evacuation tunnels. Dan approved. Yuna began building the walls. Those very walls would later save 3,000 lives. Raiders attacked Arcadia and damaged the small dome. Dan exposed Yuna as a South 3 agent and offered her a choice between arrest and working on Arcadia's defense. Yuna chose defense and, within a week, discovered 23 vulnerabilities that no one else had seen, after which she began building the defensive walls. 1 year and 2 months had passed since Dan's arrival. Arcadia now covered 2,000 acres, 6 domes, 1,000 permanent residents. Maggie's reservoir was full for the first time, 500,000 liters of clean water. Maggie climbed up onto the reservoir wall. She pulled out a flask of wake. Which one of the workers had distilled from a fungal concentrate? She took a swig. Then she shouted across all of Arcadia, "That's how it's done!" The workers below laughed. Sora shook her head. Dan smiled. Then he went back to work. There was a lot of work to do. Yuna's walls were rising along the perimeter, gray concrete forming a ring around the greenery. Not pretty, but sturdy. Yuna worked in silence, 14 hours a day. She didn't talk to anyone except Dan and Sora. Sora kept an eye on her. She made no attempt to hide it. Yuna didn't object. She took it in stride. Emily had set up a temporary medical station in the central dome. A tent with canvas walls, 2 tables, 1 cot. Not a clinic, a first aid station. But on the surface, under real light streaming through the dome's covering. Dan watched her work and thought about the promise he'd made to himself. A clinic with real windows, with sunlight. For her. For Junho, who was no longer with them. It was still too early, but soon. Haeun's peach trees had grown to knee height, 20 saplings, slender, pale, but alive. Dan came to check on them every morning. Hyun didn't know. She was busy. She was running Arcadia's entire agricultural program. 400 acres under cultivation. Tomatoes, potatoes, beans, cabbage, greens. They harvested their first crop of potatoes at the beginning of the 12th month. 120 kilograms. Not much, but potatoes. Real ones from the ground. Kane brought the first tuber to Dan. Dirty, bumpy, small. Dan took it. He held it in the palm of his hand. Heavy, solid, alive. He thought that in his past life, potatoes had cost $1 per kilogram. Here, they were priceless. Anna had moved the school entirely to the surface. A temporary building. 1 room. Walls made of recycled plastic, but with a window. A real one. Through which you could see the sky. The children sat on homemade benches and watched the clouds. Some couldn't concentrate on the lesson. They kept turning toward the window. Anna didn't scold them. She understood. It was the first time they were seeing what she'd been telling them about for 4 years. She taught the classes, biology. Now, not from photographs. She took the children out to the garden beds. She showed them how potatoes grow, how tomato plants bloom, how a worm loosens the soil. The children squealed in horror at the sight of the worm, then with delight. Then they held it in their palms and didn't want to let it go. Anna laughed. Dan saw this as he walked past the school. He stopped. He watched. Anna noticed him. She waved. He waved back. Then he walked on. But the children remained before his eyes. Children with a worm in their palms. Children seeing life for the first time. Real life. Not in a picture. The 13th month. The blow came from where they expected it. South 3. But not as they expected. Not raiders. Not a sabotage operation. A delegation. An official one. 3 people. With a white flag. With documents. Chairman Han Doyun had sent an ultimatum. Polite. Diplomatic. Essentially simple. Arcadia must hand over to South 3 the technology for neutralizing acid rain. Formulas for the solutions. Blueprints of the domes. Schematics of the buffer fields. All the data. Or South 3 would regard Arcadia as a threat and take action. Colonel Seo read the ultimatum in front of Dan. His face was stony. Then he placed the paper on the table. He looked at Dan. He asked what he thought. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said he was ready to share the technology. The colonel raised an eyebrow. Dan explained, "The technology isn't a secret. It isn't his property. It belongs to humanity. If South 3 builds its own Arcadia, that's good. More people on the surface, more food, more life. But transferring technology doesn't mean transferring control. Arcadia remains independent. South 3 gets knowledge, not power." The colonel thought for a moment. He said that Khan wouldn't agree. That Khan doesn't need knowledge, but control. That for Khan, technology is a tool of power, not a tool for life. Dan nodded. He said he knew. But the response had to be public. Let the people of South 3 know that Arcadia had offered to share. Let Khan refuse in front of his own people. The colonel looked at Dan, for the first time with a new kind of respect. Not the respect of an engineer, political respect. The response was sent over an open channel on all frequencies. Arcadia is ready to transfer all technology free of charge to any hive. The only condition, Arcadia's independence. Khan received the response, and he realized he'd lost this round. Because it's impossible to refuse free technology in front of 40,000 starving people. But accepting it would mean recognizing Arcadia as an equal. Khan chose a third path, silence. He didn't answer, neither yes nor no. Silence. And Dan knew that silence was worse than a refusal. Silence meant that Khan was planning something diplomats don't warn you about. Yuna confirmed it. She told Dan that Khan wasn't the type to back down, that if he'd fallen silent, it meant he'd moved from politics to action, and that Yug 3 had military capabilities Arcadia lacked. 2,000 trained fighters and armored vehicles. Old, but functional. Dan asked how much time they had. Yuna said that, by her estimate, 2 to 3 months. Dan nodded. 3 months. To build, to grow, to prepare. And pray that Yuna's walls would prove strong enough. Arcadia had grown to 2,000 acres and 1,000 residents, with its first potato harvest and a functioning reservoir. South 3 sent an ultimatum, and Dan responded with an open offer to transfer technology free of charge, which undermined Khan's position. Khan fell silent, which signaled preparations for military action, and Yuna estimated the time until the strike to be 2 to 3 months. A year and a half since their arrival, the strike from South 3 came 2 weeks earlier than Yuna had expected. Night, 3 o'clock. 200 fighters, not mercenaries, a regular military unit from South 3, disciplined, armed, with a plan. They struck Dome Beta, the second most important one, the agricultural dome. 400 acres of crops, grains, and legumes. 6 months of hands' work. The attack came from 2 directions, a diversionary strike on the western wall, the main assault on the eastern airlock. Yuna had anticipated exactly this scenario. The walls she had built withstood the first onslaught. Observation posts detected movement 4 minutes before contact. Sora mobilized the garrison, 120 fighters, against 200. Outnumbered. But the walls. Yuna's walls evened the odds. Every embrasure was in the right place. Every passage was covered. Every blind spot was sealed off. Dan wasn't fighting. His place was in the command center, under the central dome, next to the radio station. A map of Arcadia on the wall, tokens marking the positions of their own and the enemy's forces. He was coordinating the evacuation of Dome Beta, 1,200 people. Women, children, the elderly, the wounded. Through the tunnels he himself had designed for this very situation. 3 tunnels, from Dome Beta to the central dome, from the central dome to the Hive, and an emergency tunnel, underground, which no one but Dan and Maggie knew about, for a worst-case scenario. Anna led the children, just like during the first raid, calmly, 2 by 2, 26 students plus another 30 from the new families, 56 children. She sang to them, softly. In the tunnel, her voice bounced off the walls and sounded like an echo from another world. Haeun refused to evacuate. She stood in Dome Beta and shut off the irrigation system valves. If the attackers broke through, they could poison the water or destroy the irrigation system. Haeun was shutting off the circuits one by one, protecting the 6-month-old crop. Dan ordered her over the radio to leave. She didn't answer. He ordered her again. She said she'd be done in 10 minutes, that she wouldn't abandon the fields. Dan gripped the radio so tightly that the plastic cracked. He sent Chong after her. Chong ran up. He literally grabbed Hyun by the hand and dragged her toward the tunnel. She walked, resisting, looking back. Maggie was in Dome Beta too, but she hadn't evacuated. She'd closed the reservoir's emergency valves. If the South 3 fighters reached the tank, they could release the pressure or contaminate the supply. Maggie had sealed off access, physically. She welded the hatch shut with a welder, standing on a ladder near the ceiling, in the dark, amid the sounds of gunfire from outside. When she climbed down, her hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline. She cursed, at length, creatively, in 3 languages, including the Korean swear words she'd learned from Sora. The battle lasted 4 hours. The walls held. Sora held her ground. Her fighters repelled 3 waves. On the 4th, the attackers retreated. They left 12 wounded on the approaches. Sora didn't pursue. Dan's order: do not pursue. Hold the positions. Don't take risks. By dawn, it had quieted down. Dan stepped out of the command center. A gray morning, stale air, bullet and shrapnel marks on the walls. But the walls still stand. The domes are intact. All 1,200 people have been evacuated. Not a single civilian casualty. 3 Sora fighters were wounded, 1 critically. Emily operated on him for 4 hours. She saved him. Dan stood by the wall and looked east, where they had come from, where they would leave, and where they would come from again. Yuna approached. She stood beside him, silently. Then she said quietly that the walls had held up, that all 23 vulnerable points she'd secured had held, that without the walls, a breach would have been inevitable. Dan looked at her. He nodded. He said thank you. Yuna flinched, as if struck. Then she turned away, quickly. But Dan had seen it. Her eyes were wet. Thank you. A simple word. But for a person who had never been thanked before, it weighed as much as the world. Colonel Seo had sent reinforcements from the Hive. 50 fighters, heavily armed. He understood that the first strike had been a test. The second would be stronger. Dan agreed, and he added something to the defenses. Not a weapon, a radio station. A powerful one, aimed at South 3. He began broadcasting, every day, 3 times a day, on a frequency that ordinary receivers in South 3 could pick up. The message was simple. Arcadia is open. Technology is available. Any Hive can get the blueprints and formulas, for free, unconditionally. Come build. Not to fight. Khan could jam the frequency, but he couldn't silence the rumors. People in South 3 heard. People in South 3 talked. The people in South 3 asked questions. Why did Chairman Khan send soldiers to destroy a place where tomatoes grow? Why? For whom? Dan didn't fight. He built. And he talked about it. That was his weapon. South 3 attacked Dome Beta with 200 fighters, but Yuna's walls held, and all civilians were evacuated without casualties. Dan coordinated the defense from the command center, while Haeun and Maggie defended the dome's critical systems. After the battle, Dan began broadcasting to South-3, offering technology for free, a move that undermined Haeun's authority from within. 2 years. Arcadia covered 6,000 acres, 12 domes, 2,500 permanent residents. The water reservoir had been expanded to 2 million liters, wind turbines on the hills, solar panels behind neutralizing filters, 60% energy independence. 1 more year, and Arcadia would no longer depend on the Ulia reactor. Dan stood on the roof of the central dome and looked at what he had built. He wasn't the only one. Thousands of hands, hundreds of people. But it was his vision, his calculations, his sleepless nights. A green spot on the gray earth, visible from orbit. The peach trees had grown, 20 trees in a separate section of the small dome. The first buds appeared 2 weeks ago, pink, delicate, fragile. Dan checked on them every morning. He waited. In the third week of the second year, the first peach ripened, small, pale orange, velvety. Dan picked it. He carried it to Haeun. She was in Dome Beta. She was checking the wheat crops, Arcadia's first wheat. He approached. She turned around. She saw the peach in his hand. She froze. Dan held it out to her, whole, uncut. He told her it was hers, that no one but her had the right to eat the first one. Haeun took the peach. She held it with both hands as if it were a living thing. She sniffed it. She closed her eyes. Dan saw her lips tremble. She took a bite. Juice ran down her chin. She chewed, slowly, with her eyes closed. Then she opened her eyes, looked at Dan, and began to cry. Not quietly, not restraint, openly, loudly, standing in the middle of a wheat field with a peach in her hands. Dan stood beside her, silently. He didn't touch her. He didn't comfort her. He was just there. Haeun cried for 30 minutes. Then she wiped her face. She looked at him. She said it was the most delicious thing she'd ever eaten in her life. Dan smiled. He said the peach wasn't actually very good. Small, unripe, sour. They'd be better in a year. Haeun laughed through her tears. She said he was awful. Dan said he knew. Then he did something he hadn't done in a year and a half. He stepped forward and hugged her. Haeun froze for a second. Then she hugged him back, tightly. They stood in the middle of a wheat field, two thin, tired people smelling of earth and sweat. And Dan thought that this 1 centimeter he'd kept between them for a year and a half was the silliest distance in the history of engineering. A week later, another event took place. The first child was born in Arcadia, the daughter of Chong and his wife, who had moved from the Hive 3 months earlier. Emily delivered the baby, in a tent, in the central dome, under real light. The girl was born healthy, 3 kilograms, 200 grams. She screamed so loud you could hear her in the neighboring dome. Chong stood outside the tent, white as concrete. When Emily brought their daughter out to him, he took her in his arms and sat down on the ground, right where he was standing. His legs wouldn't hold him up. Dan arrived an hour later. He looked at the baby, tiny, red, wrinkled, perfect. Chong looked at Dan. He asked if he would be the godfather. Dan froze. Then he nodded. John named his daughter Haru, which means day, the first day. Emily stood off to the side. She looked at the baby. Her face was calm. But Dan saw her turn toward the tent window, toward the light. And think of Junho, about the boy who drew the sun. Dan approached her that evening. He said he wanted to show her something. He led her to the southern section. There stood a new module, small, walls of sulfur-reinforced concrete, a roof of transparent sheeting. Windows, real ones. Sunlight streamed in through the floor, even on a cloudy day. Inside, it was clean and bright. 2 patient rooms, a treatment room, a doctor's office, a small but real clinic. Dan turned to Emily. He said that here, the children would recover under real light, that she could name the clinic whatever she wanted. Emily stood there. She was silent. She looked at the windows, at the light, at the walls. Then she quietly said one word. Junho. Junho Clinic. Dan nodded. Emily didn't cry. She had cried her heart out long ago. But something in her face had changed. Something had shifted. Something heavy that she'd been carrying for 7 years had become a little lighter. The next morning, for the first time in 7 years, Emily woke up without a nightmare. She told Dan about it, just like that, over breakfast, in passing. Dan didn't say anything. He just pushed a bowl of real porridge made from real wheat toward her. Emily looked at the porridge, then at him, and smiled slightly, just a little, with one corner of her mouth, just like Colonel Seo. But for Emily, it was like sobbing with happiness, as if she were a different person. The first peach ripened, and Dan brought it to Hyun, after which the distance between them finally vanished. Arcadia's first child, Haru, was born, and Dan became her godfather. He built a clinic for Emily, who named it after her late son, Junho, and for the first time in 7 years, she woke up without a nightmare. 3 years, 10,000 acres, 40 domes connected by covered walkways, reservoirs holding 8 million liters, wind turbines, solar farms, schools, 3 schools. Anna ran all 3, 212 students. The Junho Clinic had been expanded into a full-fledged hospital. Emily had trained 16 nurses and 4 paramedics, a maternity ward. 9 children were born in Arcadia over the past year, all healthy, all under the open sky. Sora commanded a garrison of 300 soldiers. Yuna's walls encircled Arcadia in a continuous ring. 4 gates, 12 watchtowers, 3 lines of defense. Maggie headed the design department of 40 engineers. She trained many of them personally. Chong was among them. The young man who didn't know what a percentage was now designing the supporting structures for the domes. Hyun oversaw the entire agricultural program. 4,000 acres of crops, 300 varieties, wheat, rice, potatoes, beans, vegetables, fruits. The peach orchard had grown, 20 trees, each one bearing fruit. Dan stood on a hill north of the central dome and looked out, a green patch on the gray earth. 3 years ago, this had been a lifeless wasteland. Rusty concrete, acidic soil, a gray sky. Now, greenery, life, people. 3,200 people living on the surface, under a sky that was slowly brightening. Over the past 3 years, the pH of the rain had risen from 3.5 to 4.3 on average. In the windows, between storms, it reached 5. The atmosphere was clearing, slowly but steadily. And Dan knew why. He found out a month ago. Maggie had found the frequency, an old military frequency from the database that Colonel Seo had passed on to Dan during their first year. The frequency of the Phoenix program, an international project from 2058. A swarm of nanofactories launched into low Earth orbit to clean the atmosphere. The project was considered a failure. Contact was lost in 2059. The swarm was declared lost. But Maggie tuned the transmitter and sent a signal, the standard call sign from the documentation. 3 days of silence. On the 4th day, a reply. Brief, digital, a set of coordinates, and 1 word. In Korean, in English, in Chinese, in Spanish, in 7 languages simultaneously. We hear it. Dan sat in front of the transmitter, staring at the screen. Maggie stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. She squeezed, hard. They weren't alone. The nanofactory swarm had survived. It had evolved. It had developed something resembling a collective intelligence. And for 7 years, it had been systematically purifying the atmosphere, quietly, invisibly. Over the areas where it had detected signs of intelligent recovery, the coordinates the military had given Dan for the first expedition fell within one of those windows. It was no coincidence. The last operator of the Phoenix program had uploaded the coordinates to military databases before his death, hoping that someone would understand. Someone did understand. Colonel Seo, who quietly slipped these very coordinates to Dan, who knew more than he let on. He always knew. Dan made contact with the swarm. The communication was strange. The swarm didn't speak like a human. It transmitted data, coordinates of decontaminated zones, neutralization charts, forecasts, models, and a request, a simple one. The swarm was asking for help. Its resources were finite. The nanofactories were degrading. In 10 to 15 years, the swarm would cease to exist. If, during that time, humanity did not return to the surface and continue the cleanup on its own, everything would go back to square one. The swarm gave Dan time, a window of opportunity, a chance. Not forever, 10 to 15 years. Dan sat in front of the transmitter and thought. Then he typed his reply. "We're here. We're building. We'll continue. And thank you." The swarm replied, one word in 7 languages. "Good." And one more, one Dan hadn't expected. "There are 8 of you." 8. Dan stared at the screen. 8. Roy had transferred the consciousnesses of 8 people from different eras to different parts of the planet. Dan isn't the only one. Somewhere in South America, in Africa, in Europe, in North America, 7 more like him. Engineers, doctors, agronomists, builders, each in their own hive, each with their own set of knowledge, each building their own Arcadia. The swarm wasn't just purifying the atmosphere, it was bringing people back, the right people, to the right places, at the right moment. The last hope of a dying program to save the world. Dan leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. His new life was no accident, no miracle, no magic. It was a calculation, a cold, precise calculation by an artificial intelligence that had spent 7 years searching for a way to give humanity a chance. And it had found it. He opened his eyes, stood up, walked over to Colonel Seo, told him everything. The colonel listened in silence. Then he nodded, said he knew about Phoenix. Not everything, but he knew the coordinates weren't random, that someone or something was helping. He hadn't told Dan because he was afraid Dan wouldn't believe him, and he might get scared. Dan grunted. He said that in 3 years in this world, he'd forgotten how to be scared. Chairman Han arrived a week later, in person, without an army, without security, alone. An old man, 63 years old, gray-haired, stooped, tired. He asked for a meeting. Dan received him in the central dome, at a table. Tea, real tea, made from leaves that Hyun had grown in the greenhouse. Han drank in silence. Then he spoke. He said that his hive was dying, that the South 3 reactor had reached the end of its service life a month ago, that they had switched to emergency mode, that they had 4 months' worth of food supplies, that he had come to ask, not to demand, to ask. Dan looked at him. He didn't see an enemy standing before him, just a weary old man who had kept 40,000 people alive for 30 years, as best he could, as he knew how, with the tools he had, scarcity and control, the only tools he knew. Dan said that Arcadia would take in the people from South 3, all of them, no strings attached. Han looked at him. His eyes were wet. He asked quietly what he wanted in return. Dan said nothing. Khan didn't understand. He asked again. Dan repeated himself. Nothing. Technology for free. There's land for construction. People are needed. Hands are needed. South 3 means 40,000 pairs of hands. This isn't charity. It's a calculation. More people, more domes, faster growth. 10 to 15 years. The window the swarm had given them. They couldn't waste a single day. Khan sat there. He was silent. Then he stood up. He bowed, deeply. The old way, the way they used to bow before the catastrophe. And he left. Dan learned later that on the evening of that day, Khan had issued his final order, an order to sabotage, sent even before their arrival in Arcadia. A group of 12 saboteurs was supposed to destroy the neutralizing cascade of the main reservoir. But Khan didn't cancel the order because he didn't have time. Yuna intercepted the group. The walls were operational. The warning system was operational. 12 saboteurs were detained on the outer perimeter, without a single shot fired. Yuna stood before them. She used to be just like them, an agent, a tool, a weapon. Now a defender. Han found out about the failure an hour later. He went to see Dan. His face was ashen. He said the order had been given before the visit, before tea, before the conversation, that he would have canceled it if he'd had time. Dan looked at him for a long time. Then he said he believed him. Khan sat down. He covered his face with his hands. His shoulders were shaking. Then he took his hands away. His face was wet. He said he'd kept people underground for 30 years. He'd said the surface meant death, that they had to wait. 100 years, 200, as long as it took. And he believed it, sincerely. And now he's sitting in the dome, drinking tea made from leaves that grew under the open sky. And he realizes he was wrong. 30 years. Dan didn't say anything. What could he say? 30 years of faith shattered by a single cup of tea. Evening, opening night. The Arcadia Open Air Theater, the first theater under the open sky in 17 years. A wooden stage, benches made of recycled plastic, 1,500 spectators. The play was called The Man Who Came with the Rain, written by a local playwright, a former literature teacher from Ulya. On stage, the actors played out the story of the last 3 years, reimagined like a legend. A man who came from nowhere, who saw a barren land and saw a garden within it, who built not walls, but dreams. Dan sat in the front row, Haeun to his left, her hand in his, warm, smelling of earth. Emily was on his right, calm, with dry eyes, truly calm for the first time in 7 years. Behind them was Sora, out of uniform, in a simple dress, the first one in her life. She sat next to her father, Colonel Seo, in civilian clothes, also a first for him. Anna was next to them, a ukulele on his lap, Maggie to his side, a flask in his pocket, grinning. Yuna at the edge of the row, quiet, composed, but not on guard. For the first time, not on guard. Han Doyun sat in the back row, alone, a small, gray-haired man among the 1,500 people he had wanted to destroy, and who had accepted him. He looked at the stage. He wept silently. The sky above them was dark, nighttime. The clouds parted. For the first time in a long time. And the stars began to appear, one by one, through the clear atmosphere, dim, distant, but real. The children in the auditorium craned their necks. Some had never seen the stars, didn't know they existed. They knew only from Anna's stories, and there they were, real. The play's final scene ended. The actors took their bows. Silence. Then applause. 1,500 pairs of hands clapping, a sound like rain, pure rain. And then a line appeared in the sky, thin, glowing, like a stroke of chalk on a blackboard, a swarm of nanofabrics. For the first time in 7 years of secret work, it appeared to people for the first time. The line moved, it curved, it drew. Letters, in Korean, one word. People looked up, silently. Children pointed. The word burned in the night sky. Thank you. Hyun squeezed Dan's hand, tightly. Emily looked up, then at Dan, then up again. Maggie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in her life, She was at a loss for words. Sora stood up, saluted the sky. Yuna stared at the glowing word, her palm pressed against her chest. Her face was wet, but calm. Calm for the first time. Anna began to play, softly, on the ukulele, a melody she had written herself about the man who brought back the sky. The strings didn't go out of tune. For the first time, they didn't go out of tune. Dan stood up, slowly. He looked at the glowing word in the sky. Then he turned to his team, to the people who, for 3 years, had built this miracle of concrete, dirt, and stubbornness alongside him. He said quietly, "Well then, now the real work begins." Hyun smiled. Emily nodded. Maggie raised her flask. Sora gave a thumbs up. Yuna stood up straight. Anna played. The stars were shining, and the word in the sky slowly faded, as if a swarm had smiled and gone off to keep working, just like them.